Oh, and I think I will drop that handout now before I forget about it. Mm, I think I have to unpresent for a second. Okay. Well, I hope everybody is having a great day. I hope that you did not have as much drama as I did. Okay, I have my fold. Oh, there it is. Okay. And now I just have to open up the chat. Here is a handout that might help you today. And I'll get back to the presentation. So my name's Kate Penney Howard. I live very near to Fort Wayne, Indiana, but I did in the summer of 1992 live in Champaign or Urbana. I can't remember which one, but I know that it's called Shampoo Banana. And I am so glad that you have invited me to talk to you today. I am a genetic genealogist, and what I do is help people discover brick walls using their DNA or identify parents. So today, I'm going to talk to you about the genealogical proof standard and how you can use DNA with it. And we'll talk all about everything. And I hope that you don't think it's too much information. But if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat as we go, and I'll try and address them. So the phrase "beyond a shadow of a doubt" does not come from a courtroom. It comes from Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta called The Gondoliers. So that is the origin of that particular phrase, "beyond a shadow of a doubt." Um, This is my puppy Poppy. She has just left the room, so she will not be interrupting us, but she is a Weimaraner and very amazing. I just love her so much. So, documentary evidence is a term that comes from legal principles about things that are beyond personal testimony that are admissible for court. So, for documentary evidence to be admissible in court, it has to meet certain standards. First, it has to be relevant to the case. Second, it has to be authenticated, establishing that the document is actually what it claims to be. So, for example, the last time that I was in a courtroom, the lawyer for one party wanted to show printouts of texts from a cell phone as part of their evidence. And in order to do this, she had to present the images to both parties and ask if they agreed that they were screenshots of texts that they had participated in and that they were unaltered and true and valid. And this protects against someone manufacturing a false document, which I think happens quite a bit. They can be um, audio visual, they can be x-rays or blueprints or written documents, really anything that you can hand to somebody. And of course, say, wait, I'm not a lawyer. Why do I need to know these things? I'm a genealogist. Well, there are some genealogists who are lawyers, like Judy Russell or Blaine Bettner. You might have heard of them. But there are also forensic genealogists who contribute to legal cases. And they may talk about um, missing and unknown heirs. They may talk about claims to real estate, right? If one person owns some real estate and then 50 years after they die, they figured out that, nobody actually has taken possession of it, they have to do descendancy research to find out who the heirs are of that particular property. Mineral interests are the same thing. Some states we don't have a lot of mineral interests, but if you happen to be in a state that had a lot of mining or oil production, mineral interests would be very desirable to research. Genealogists can be asked to work with people who are trying to claim citizenship, either with the United States or with many tribal offices. You might hear a genealogist being called to testify in a hearing about a false memoir. If you read a memoir, you're like, I don't really, is that really how it went? And the genealogist will go, okay, well, I can tell what high school they went to, and I can tell where they worked, and things like that. It could be used in a reparations case or a tort case where someone is trying to be made whole after some kind of injustice has happened. And it can even be used in capital mitigation, which is when someone is up for the death penalty. The genealogist may be called to talk about things that had happened in that person's life, which contributed to the situation. There are also genetic genealogists who use DNA to establish a person's ancestry or locate a perpetrator of a crime or identify human remains. I'm not a lawyer, and maybe many of you are not lawyers, but understanding these legal standards can help genealogists apply a similar rigor to their own documentary evidence, to their own research, and ensure that sources are relevant, authenticated, and as close to original as possible when we construct our arguments. And then we get to the question of a proof argument. What is that? So there are 5 elements of what is called the genealogical proof standard, and these can all be found in a book called Genealogy Standards. And these 5 principles are applied across the board in all genealogical work to measure the credibility of conclusions about ancestral identities, relationships, and life events. So the 5 elements are: you should have conducted reasonably exhaustive research. Each statement of fact has a complete and accurate source citation. The evidence is reliable and has been skillfully correlated and interpreted. Any contradictory evidence has been resolved. The conclusion has been soundly reasoned and coherently written. And at any time, any proof statement is subject to re-evaluation when new evidence arises. And standards like these are the best practices for genealogy. They enable every genealogist, not just professional ones, not just, BCG associates, to come as close as possible to what actually happened in history. Kind of like when you see a show about a surgeon, for example, when a surgeon gets done with an operation, they have to go through a careful assessment of all of the tools that they have in front of them. They have to count for every single item that was in the operating room during the surgery because we don't want to have someone sewn up with a sponge or a tool inside of them. So this is just that same kind of care that we make sure that we have done everything that we can to ensure that our research is true. So there are 3 main types of DNA tests that are used in genealogy. You can think of them as different chapters of your family story. The Y-DNA test on the left tells your father's father's story, and Y DNA is passed down relatively unchanged from father to son, which makes it perfect for researching surname lines. Mitochondrial DNA is a different kind of DNA. If you see in this picture of a cell, you can see the mitochondrion there. And the mitochondrial DNA comes from inside of the mitochondria, as opposed to the DNA, which you can see wrapped up in this purple circle inside of the cell. Mitochondrial DNA is, like Y DNA, also an ancient DNA. It tells your mother's mother's story, and everybody inherits mitochondrial DNA. And while not as genealogically useful as other tests, it can provide insights into your ancient maternal ancestry. Both Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA can reach back thousands of years. Autosomal DNA is a different test, which is the most common and the least expensive, and it tells the story of all of your ancestors mixed together. Autosomal DNA can reach back about 400 years, but it is quite difficult to get back that far, and 200 to 300 years is much more common. Generally, I only work with autosomal DNA when I am working on a brick wall mystery. However, there have been times that I have used Y-DNA. Autosomal DNA testing can be done at or uploaded to Ancestry, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, Living DNA, and GEDmatch. For the average North American wanting to begin looking at your own DNA results, comparing your ancestry test against your own known family tree is probably the best place to start. Every company has their strengths and their weaknesses. Ancestry DNA has the largest database of matches, and also it's got some really good family trees and resources. Family Tree DNA specializes in Y DNA testing and mitochondrial DNA testing, but they also have autosomal DNA testing or uploads there. 23andMe offers health insights, and MyHeritage and Living DNA are both strong for people who have recent European connections. So the question then is, how do we effectively incorporate DNA into our genealogical research? DNA testing has revolutionized genealogy and opened new doors for researchers who have been facing brick walls for years. It has provided identity for people who may have a misattributed parentage event, so they were adopted or donor conceived, or they just didn't know who their parent was. But how do we properly document and present DNA evidence? This is what we'll talk about today. We'll start by examining the different types of proofs that incorporate DNA evidence, from simple proof statements to complex proof arguments. And then we'll explore various organizational structures for writing proof arguments, essential figures and tables that you might want to include, and the standards that govern DNA evidence in genealogy. And by the end of the presentation, you should have a clear roadmap for writing your own DNA proof argument. If you were not here when we first started, I did drop a handout into the chat. So the different types of proof that can be incorporated with DNA are the first and the smallest are proof statements. They are the simplest form, and they are straightforward phrases that state a genealogical fact that can be supported by one or two citations, not a lot. In DNA context, proof statements are typically used when the relationship is pretty obvious, such as a parent-child match in autosomal DNA, where you just know that that's a parent and child. For example, a simple proof statement might say something like this: based on a shared autosomal DNA segment of 17 centimorgans between tester A and tester B on Ancestry DNA, indicating a likely shared ancestor within the past 5 to 7 generations, combined with supporting traditional genealogical records, it is concluded that tester A is a direct descendant of Bob Smith, right? That's a pretty simple uh, explanation of what you believe and why. Proof summaries require more explanation, usually 2 to 3 paragraphs. They might include a bulleted list of evidence or explain easily resolved conflicts with traditional genealogy. An example would be using Y-DNA results and autosomal DNA matches showing a close genetic distance between two men whose relationship can also be proven through traditional records. The third category, proof arguments, are the most complex. They are used for cases with large bodies of evidence and multiple pieces of conflicting information, maybe many testers. And these often incorporate multiple hypotheses which must be disproven. Within proof arguments, you might have several proof statements and summaries that build your case. DNA evidence in these arguments may include multiple test takers and various types of DNA. You might see this in a journal responding to previous works published by genealogists. I'm moving around the chat window so I can see. Once you have completed your research and you are ready to write your proof argument, you need to choose an organizational structure. And there are three main approaches. The most common method is to present documentary evidence first, right? The birth certificates, the census records, the newspaper articles, and then follow that with DNA evidence. This approach begins with an introduction of your research question, followed by a logical presentation of traditional evidence. After establishing the case with your documentary evidence, you then introduce DNA testing as a method to verify your hypotheses. And this section typically includes background on DNA inheritance, methodology, and analysis of results. The second approach involves weaving your DNA and your documentary evidence together throughout the article. And this integrates both types of evidence by generation or family line, creating a more interconnected narrative. And the third approach is the one that I am always using because I get cases that are mysteries and then they ask if we can solve them with DNA. Um, so we present the genetic evidence first, and then we find the documentary evidence that goes along with it. And this is less common, but it can be effective. Regardless of which structure you like or which one you choose to use, your goal is to build a logical case that leads readers through your evidence and your reasoning. So visual elements are crucial in DNA-based proof arguments. They help readers understand complex genetic relationships and data patterns that would be cumbersome to explain in text alone. You should include detailed descendant charts showing the lineage of all test takers. You can make these charts in any tool or application. I like to use Banyan DNA or What Are the Odds from DNA Painter because I need to use those to calculate the relationships between the testers and where they might fit in a tree when I'm trying to identify a mystery. But you can use lucid charts if you are just mapping it out. And a lot of people will start with the ancestor at the top and then all the descendants down below with every tester marked. This particular one, we were trying to identify a person's great grandfather. And we had, so I laid out all of the matches in DNA Painter. What are the odds? And I've anonymized them so I can show them to you today. So some of the matches are fairly large for the particular relationship that we're looking at, but I'm working with quite small matches as well. Two of them I would normally throw out because they are below the threshold that I like of 15 centimorgans, but I have included them in this particular chart because we didn't have anybody else who had tested on those lines. So normally I would not use, a 13 or an 11 centimorgan test. So if you have not used what are the odds before, what it does is you put all your information in there and then you you click show me your hypotheses and the system will tell you where the tester might fall in this family tree based on probability. However, the big difference between Banyan DNA and what are the odds is that Banyan DNA can handle multiple relationships between testers. So, for example, you may be related to a match on your maternal side and on your paternal side, which will show an inflated amount of centimorgan for just the side that you may be because you have two relationships, it's going to look like you're closer than you actually are. So these charts should include source citations for each parent-child link, maybe birth and death dates, things like that. Um, the some of the best articles that you will see examples of this are published by the National Genealogical Society quarterly, and some of those can use like 2 or 3 page charts with all kinds of things showing who descends from the research subject. And when you create your charts, just consider how to make them reader friendly. One approach is to number or letter your test takers rather than using their full names, or make a fake name for each tester and start, Abby, Bobby, Charlie, Doug. And so people can find them when they look at the chart and they don't have to comb through it to figure out what you're talking about. And whether you privatize your testers or not, we have to be able to see that clear line of descent, and really putting it into a chart like this is so much better at communicating our thoughts than writing it all out in a paragraph. So your proof argument should include several types of figures depending on your case. And these typically include charts that show lines of descent from common ancestral couples. And these help readers visualize how test takers connect to each other through the ancestors that you are researching. Diagrams showing the lineage of a single tester to the research subject can clarify key relationships. When working with multiple hypotheses, we can include diagrams of hypothesized relationships to the research subject so that readers can follow your reasoning process, right? You need to explain what you've discovered. Family trees for people who have tested and their matches can provide context for understanding genetic connections. And for autosomal DNA evidence, triangulated segment diagrams showing overlapping DNA regions between matches can be really powerful as well. So you could do that at DNA Painter's chromosome tool. And several of the platforms also have chromosome browsers where you can compare and look for regions of similar DNA between your matches. Remember that, oops, what did I do? Remember that each parent-child link that you show in your diagrams has to be documented with at least one citation. Some authors use online trees to document these links, but that doesn't mean that they didn't already review the documentation. When I work on genetic genealogy cases, quite often I will find errors in the trees of matches. Perhaps they didn't know who their parent was, and they put in their adoptive family tree, or they've just got a big question mark, or they did not know that they were donor conceived, and so they've put their family of origin in there and not necessarily their biological family. Quite often, I will see people putting their step grandfather in as their grandfather. Now, this makes total sense because that may have been the only grandfather that they knew. And I remember I had a step great grandfather, and I didn't understand until I was much older that he wasn't actually my great grandfather. So, tables also, like Excel spreadsheets, are equally important for how we can present our data so that other people can understand it. And the most common tables in DNA proof arguments include tables that show the total amount of shared centimorgans of DNA between your base testers, because this helps establish baseline relationships within your test group. So maybe I want to look at my close cousins because I'm working on a speculation about a distant cousin and a more distant ancestor. So we build out the relationships that we know. So how much DNA does Abby share with Bobby, and how much DNA does Bobby share with Charlie, and how much does Charlie share with Abby? So tables that compare the total shared centimorgans against proposed relationships. And the best place to find that information is from the Shared Centimorgan Project at DNA Painter. For Y-DNA evidence, you want to have tables of STR marker values between the people who have taken that Y-DNA test. And another important table shows how complete people's trees are. Because again, if there is a dual relationship between two people that you are not aware of, the shared centimorgans are going to be inflated and the tools are not going to work properly, but you're also not going to know via which piece of DNA, like via which ancestor this DNA is coming from. So if someone is related to you on both their maternal side and their paternal side, or they're related multiple times on one side, you could trick yourself into coming to the wrong conclusion because you didn't know that they were double cousins. So there is a book called Genealogy Standards. The second edition was published in 2019, and it includes specific standards for using DNA evidence. And these standards should guide your proof argument. These standards require us to address factors that can affect genetic relationship determination and includes addressing the possibility of multiple common ancestors between testers, which can be then dealt with if we have large trees. So that's exactly what I was just talking about. Another standard encourages using a sufficient number of testers and matches. So, for example, on that DNA Painter, what are the odds? Image that I shared with you, I mentioned that I had a 11 centimorgan and a 13 centimorgan match that I had included that normally I would not. So again, I wanted to make sure we had a sufficient number of testers. The last standard that I want to share with you, it says that your research results should include enough detail and identifying information so that other people can verify your conclusions. So this might involve asking matches to transfer their results to Maybe you want to work all on MyHeritage because everybody can transfer to MyHeritage, or you might want to look at GEDmatch. You might want to use the Are Your Parents Related tool or any of the other great, tools like clustering and things like that at GEDmatch. So, if you have one person at Ancestry and one person at 23andMe and one person at MyHeritage, you can't compare them. And even though these standards have only been formalized in the past 6 years, they represent the best practices that have evolved over the time that we have been doing genealogy and DNA at the same time. So if you look at some of the earliest genealogical proofs using DNA, they may not follow the standards, but they still will probably demonstrate sound methodologies. So, a critical question is when you should include DNA evidence. Um, some people will say, like this quote here from Nancy Werner, if traditional documentary sources can provide a solid answer, the additional effort of DNA analysis may not be necessary. And DNA evidence is only required when you want to establish that a relationship is biological. Not all cases require DNA, and there are many scenarios where DNA would not be acceptable or useful. So, for example, I have a birth certificate that says I was born in Anchorage, Alaska in 1972, and that my father was Keith Allen Penney, and that my mother was Gloria something something. And I hope I didn't just tell you all enough information, internet, to, spoof me. But anyway, um, I have that document that happens to also um, correlate with my biological history. So it wouldn't necessarily be necessary for me to use that DNA to back it up, but it doesn't hurt. It always helps, right? You could end your proof by saying, and DNA evidence backs up this premise, for example. Um, if your documentary evidence seems thin or potentially subject to challenges, in these situations, DNA evidence can bolster your case substantially. I am not an investigative genealogist. I do not work on legal cases. However, if I look at how cases work, right, you have circumstantial evidence, and then you have evidence that can actually mm, be used beyond a reasonable doubt. So sometimes you only have one piece of evidence in a case that is not circumstantial. And in that case, you want to include everything that you possibly can that is circumstantial in case that first bit of evidence gets thrown out. And if you do determine that DNA is important to your case, please be careful to gather significant amounts of matches because you want to be able to draw reasonable and meaningful conclusions. So the further back in time that you are researching, the more donors that you will likely need, since the possibility, once we get past second cousins, is that people may not share any DNA, even though they share a common ancestor. That is specifically for autosomal DNA. DNA should always complement and confirm your research, not replace it. So the benefits of publishing your research, there are a lot of benefits. Whether you are publishing in a journal or for a lineage society application or your own genealogy website or for a local genealogical society, there are a lot of benefits to you. The first one is the satisfaction of finally proving a relationship that may have stumped you for years. The peer review process provides valuable validation and refinement of your work. Peer review provides outside perspectives that help us to refine our arguments. When you write for publication, it also improves your skills as a writer and a genealogist. I will tell you that I do my most careful work when I know that it is going to be looked over with a fine-tooth comb by an expert. And the process of examining every piece of evidence minutely often reveals connections that we hadn't previously noted. And writing down the results of a case study really helped me consider whether I've gotten the right conclusion, right? I sit there and I think, oh, well, what if this other scenario is also true? Because we don't always come to one conclusion. Like I showed you the hypotheses on the what are the odds chart. There were three, I think, hypotheses there. One of them was the strongest, but they're all possible. By publishing your work, you also contribute to the broader genealogical community's knowledge, and you can potentially help other people with similar research challenges. So I have a genealogical proof that I need to write out someday. I have an ancestor who was born in 1780, and about 50 years ago, someone wrote a book about him and his descendants. And they specifically said there is absolutely no reason that people should be connecting this man to these two people and saying that they are his parents. There is no documentary evidence to prove that this Bob Smith is the Bob Smith that was born to this couple. And the only problem is when I open up my DNA matches, I have matches to this couple that cannot possibly be the ancestor of my guy. So I need to write out my discovery. And I'm not refuting the work of this person who did it 50 years ago, but I am saying, well, now that we have this other tool, we have in fact learned that Bob Smith's parents are actually those people. Wendy asks, are there Facebook groups or other resources that we can turn to if we want someone to check our work as we dip our toes into DNA research? That is a great question. If you are a member of Genealogy Squad, which is one of my favorite Facebook groups, you will notice that if anybody asks a question about DNA, they are immediately shut down by the admins, and the admins refer them to another group, which is called Genetic Genealogy Tips and Tricks or Tips and Techniques. And that was founded by Blaine Bettinger, who is a phenomenal genetic genealogist. And so that is one that I really like. There is another one that's a little more kind of science oriented called the DNA Roundtable. And I'm not saying that genetic genealogy tips and tricks is not science oriented as well. But genetic genealogy tips and tricks usually focuses on these techniques and these questions like the one that Wendy asked. Um, looking for somebody to check my work. So people will, scratch on the back of the envelope their people that descend from these ancestors and who matches who and things like that. And then they'll take a picture of it and post it on there and say, am I right? Does this work? Or I might post a Watto and say, I'm having a problem with this because this person should fall here, but I have this weird match over here that's not working right. Bobby says there is a debate over the lineage of one of my ancestors in the 17th century. How can I use my DNA results to find out which branch my ancestor came from? Bobby, that's a great question. And I have another presentation about that, and it's not a fast answer. So if you would like to send me an email, and I'll just type my email here really quick because it's not on that handout I gave you. That's my email address. Please send me an email and I will get you information. Thank you. Okay. back to, I got three more slides and then we can ask questions. So we have challenges also in DNA research if you want to publish it. One of the biggest hurdles is contacting matches and obtaining their permission to use their results. It's a good idea to get permission up front before you start the project, before you get to the answer that you want to publish, because it can be really upsetting if you can't publish that. Now, for example, I have a case, which is one of the cases that I have been obsessed and fascinated with for a couple of years. There were five individuals who were either children or children of children of one man. And they were born over their parent. So the children of the man would have been born within about a 25-year range. They were all born, one was born in New York City, one was born in Cleveland, one was born in Chicago, and I'm not sure, but the other one came from another large city. And I began to obsess about this case. I was working on it with a couple other researchers, and we started to find famous people in the trees as we were working on them. One of them was a famous R&B singer, and he was a cousin to them, maybe like a second cousin. And we began digging further and further back, and we found someone who had been a singer on vaudeville as well, very closely related to this cousin. And we came up with the speculation of what if we are looking at the children of somebody who was with like a music group? What if, either a roadie or a performer, but what if this guy was going to all of these big cities over the span of 30 years and conceived children after each show, and they're all related somehow? That is exactly what happened. I found five children from a famous singer. Now, am I ever going to tell you which famous singer this was? No. Am I going to tell you who these people are? No. Am I going to tell you, how the other matches are related to each other? No. But I can tell you this story. Thank you, Amanda. So, I can publish the story, but I don't want to, tell other people's private information. So I can share the scenario, but I can't share the specifics. Another significant challenge is the time and the financial investment that you have to put in. Amanda, it was like the best thing that ever happened to me. Yes. Um, so you have to put a lot of money into meeting all of the genealogical proof standards, right? You might need to order birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, all sorts of things that actually cost money. I hired somebody who does research in the National Archives for service members whose personnel file was destroyed in the fire of 1972 or 3. And that was $500. He did a really good job, but it was a big crapshoot for me because I wasn't sure what he was going to be able to find. So for those that are publishing in journals, you then will also have length constraints, right? You may not be able to put that big chart in there because they may limit how much space you can have. And then finally, technical writing presents its own difficulties. Writing can be painful and feel inefficient, but at the end of it, you have birthed something. So this is a great bit of advice here by Thomas Jones, who is the author of the first NGSQ case that was reliant upon autosomal DNA. He said, do not ignore any potentially useful documentary evidence. Keep an open mind about possible conclusions and ensure that you have asserted the only possible answer to your research question. So I'll tell you one that was a very interesting mix of DNA and documentary evidence. I could not figure out how the mother and the father in a unknown parentage case had encountered each other. And then I looked at a map and they shared a backyard. So their backyards butted up against each other. So that's a huge, huge, like, piece of evidence right there, right? We had the means of them being together, maybe without even leaving their home. So keep an open mind about the things that might be true. Let's see, I'll move to the next slide. So DNA is a powerful tool when you use it correctly. Please follow established standards and best practices. Read those published examples because there is so much to learn in them. And if you like a good story, there's usually a good story in there too. Remember that DNA supports documentary evidence and does not just stand on its own. We have to have some kind of documentary evidence in there because otherwise, all we can do is test mom, test dad, and test kid and say, yep, this is the biological mom and dad of this child. But if we include documentary evidence, then we can actually solve mysteries. We need to know family trees of testers and things like that. So thank you all for listening, and I would be happy to entertain any questions on any topic. And I thank you for surviving this one because it's one of the nerdier presentations. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and talk if you'd like.
Kate, this is kind of a question for the whole crowd. I'm kind of
Sarah, I cannot hear you.
oh,
Far away from the microphone?
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I am curious if anyone attending tonight has attempted to incorporate their DNA results into their genealogy research.
I have, but it's only because I'm also a genetic genealogist. I didn't want to leave you just hanging there, sitting there with no one answering you.
That's cool. Good. Well, maybe this can get people started a little bit, dip their
Yeah.
toes in it.
You can get really carried away with, proving your paper tree with DNA. I'm frustrated because my father, I asked him to take a Y-DNA test. I have a very boring ancestry, and there's no murders, there's no dalliances, things like that. But so I asked my dad to take a Y-DNA test. His grandfather was from Northern Ireland, and it's difficult to research Northern Irish cases. Um, so my dad took the test. His last name is Penney, and his Y-DNA test was Armstrong. And so I began to do more research and speculation. My great grandfather was most of his matches are double cousins on paper because we had two brothers marry two sisters from another family. So because of this, it obfuscated the lack of matches to the Penny line because we had the Pennies and McVeighs coming together in another cousin. um, once I realized that we were not genetically pennies, I began looking at the Armstrong matches that we had, and I was able to isolate um, 4 or 5 Armstrongs who were who were matches to us through autosomal DNA, who came from the same village. And the problem is there's no paper, there's no documentary evidence to connect these people to a most recent common ancestor. However, my great great uncle, whose last name was Penney, is buried next to the Armstrong relatives of one of these matches. So there's got to be some kind of a story. In Northern Ireland, adoptions were not documented until about 1920. And so, and I think there were always interfamily, intra-family adoptions where somebody was like, here, take your nephew, or, so we may never know because the documentary evidence is not there to support the hypothesis that I have. But my hypothesis is that my great grandfather or my great great grandfather, it'd have to be my great great grandfather, was adopted and he was an Armstrong. That's my speculation, but there's just no way for me to tell. So, yes, there's definitely a story, Amanda, but I don't know it. And that's probably why I like doing genetic genealogy so much because, like, you never know what story you're going to unwrap. And I always ask people, tell me what you want to know and what you don't want to know. So I have uncovered uh, people doing things with axes like Lizzie Borden. And I have uncovered what probably one of the strangest was a man who told his children to bury him in the backyard so they could keep cashing his checks. And this was on, national news. He was one of like 5 brothers who could be the possible parent of this person. And so I, had it narrowed down to one of 5 brothers, and there was no way without additional testing for me to know exactly which one was the culprit. And so I talked to the person and I said, I don't know how to tell you this, but you might not want to go to any family barbecues until like we figure this out. It's like, bury me in the backyard and collect my check. That was very nice of him. Oh, Amanda hasn't had anything that exciting. The big joke is I always get the doozy cases. So there'll always be like somebody driving their car into Lake Michigan or, with their family in the car or whatever. I mean, it's just I I have to take breaks sometimes because sometimes it's really traumatic to have to deal with all of these things. If you know about the flu epidemic that happened about 100 years ago, um, you can find entire families who died in the flu epidemic, or if there was a house fire, you know, as all these people died on the same day or within moments of each other. It was just incredibly traumatic.
Kate, what you mentioned Northern Ireland is
Yeah.
particularly hard to do research in. How come?
That there's just no information. There's no documentation. Very little survived. So that's something that a lot of populations encounter. African Americans, the documentation that we have for people before the 1860s can be very difficult. Um, People did not have last names. Um, their ages would be altered because the younger a person is, the more valuable they are. And so people would become their people's birth dates would change as the censuses or the documents that show us that they existed. You have to not take things super literally sometimes because ages get changed. Um, anybody who comes from a population that has experienced significant upheaval from warfare, violence. We hear about war babies a lot. So the GI goes to war and leaves doesn't even know that they have a child, and then um, and that's something that's happened since war. And then we also have, along with poverty, comes vulnerability to many things. And because of the way biology works, it's usually women who are the ones who are taken advantage of, et cetera. Coercion is something that we don't think enough about. Many times, especially, for example, in Appalachia, when people lived in coal mining towns, that coal mining town literally owned your life. I sold my soul to the company store. Well, if your husband went down into the mine and had something, break his foot, he couldn't work. And so he was sent to the company doctor who then sent a bill to your house, and he was off work and you had no money. So there was something that they called Esau script that references the story in the Old Testament about Esau whose inheritance was stolen. So Esau's script was basically a contract between the leaders of the coal company and the wife of the injured miner. And she had a particular amount of time to pay that money off. And if she did not, then she had to have an encounter with some man in leadership of the coal company. And so this is it's a particularly horrifying story, but the more affected somebody is by poverty and injustice, the more hiccups we will see in the DNA.
Wow.
And if you are recently, if you were born in Europe or both of your parents were born in Europe, it's really difficult to find matches. And other areas of the world are much more difficult. So genetic genealogy doesn't really work well. If you were born in Asia, unless you were the child of, you know, a GI, and then we can figure out the GI side, but not necessarily um,
Mhm.
if we were looking for the mother's identity, we might have the best matches we might have might be fourth cousins. It's just impossible.
Wow. Ugh.
Yeah, I know there's lots and lots to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, we've hit 7, so if there aren't any other questions, um, I think we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Kate. That was really fascinating. That was really cool. I'm
Thank
excited
you.
to share this video out afterwards. Um, all right. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I know I'll see we've got some regulars in attendance, so I'll see some of you in the archive soon. But if anyone else, we can't help you with genealogy, or I mean with DNA, we can help you with genealogy. So come on in.
I was like, what? You can't?
No, that's the one we can do. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, so much. I really appreciate it. And please reach out to me on Facebook or by email if you would like to talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.